You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 190. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Happy 2025. If you're listening to this podcast when it goes live, we are a week into the new year, and I hope that 2025 is off to a fabulous start for you. Today is actually the new year, the day that I'm recording this episode. I'm at home. I've got family in and out of the house, so you might hear a little bit of rustling and bustling in the background. We had a super quiet New Year's Eve, which was delightful. We spent it as a family, just the four of us, having a nice dinner at home. We watched a family movie. We watched the updated version of Vacation, which has some really hilarious moments in it. And now I'm just thinking about you and thinking about the new year and thinking about things that I want to create in terms of intentions and how I want my practice to unfold and also how I want your practice to unfold. So today's episode is really about one of the intentions that I have in mind that I think will resonate with a lot of the lawyers that are listening, right? It might really resonate with you. It certainly is a topic that has come up with a lot of the lawyers that I've worked with in my coaching practice. Now, taking a little bit of a step back, I wanted to share that this year, one of the themes that I'm focusing on is removing, right? I'm looking at decluttering and less of things. One of the inspirations for that is a famous quote by Michelangelo, who sculpted David, right? This is an iconic statue. It's the image, the figure, I suppose, of the so-called perfect man. It is in a museum in Florence, or at least it was a few years back when I went to see it. And it is just thought of as one of the most beautiful and perfect sculptures ever made. And apparently, when Michelangelo was asked how he created such a magnificent statue, his response was, "It was easy. I simply removed everything that was not David." Right? So cool, so powerful. So I've been thinking about this quote and I've been applying it to various aspects of my life, right? Removing everything that is not X. And I'd invite you to bear this in mind as you're reflecting on your year and what some of the things are that you would want to remove in order to reveal whatever it would be for you that is the statue of David. Okay, so that's one of the concepts that I'm inviting you to think about. Another shift that I'm making this year is that I'm focusing more on going deep with the learning and the concepts and the programs that I have, where I want to focus more on applying what I've been learning as opposed to studying more. Now, this might resonate with some of you. I know for you in a legal practice, it might look a little bit different relative to how I operate in a coaching practice. But what it ultimately means is a bias toward action. So if you find that you're one of those people that likes to reflect on things, perhaps to the point of overthinking them or overcomplicating them, or finding yourself getting overwhelmed and instead of taking action, you kind of stay stuck, this might resonate with you as well, right? So the idea here is, number one, we're paring back, right, on the things that we're doing, on how we're spending our time, what we're investing in, what we're choosing to prioritize. So that's the less part of it. And then the more part of it, right? We're going to be doing more actions that are aligned toward the things that we want to create. So one of the themes that I would like to highlight today in particular is this idea of less stress and more done. Now, this idea of stress in your practice is something that I think is just something we all need to live with, right? Stress is actually relatively healthy to have as a human being, right? We want to know if we're about to get hit by a car. We want to know if there's a fire in our house. We want to know if there's a deadline at work that we need to meet. We want to have stress in our life. It does serve a purpose. It keeps us safe. It keeps us on track. And so the idea of having a stress-free practice is something that I think is probably unlikely to ever happen and likely undesirable. So notice the language. It's less stress, not no stress. And at the same time, I'm thinking about how you can get more done, right? So there's less stress and yet you're producing more, ideally producing more of the things that you want to create. And I'd love for you to start thinking of these two things as a pair, right? Less stress, more done, because this is quite a shift in the sense of what I observe in my practice and what I've experienced as a lawyer and just as a professional generally is that we often have this link between stress and getting things done. So you might think, well, I've got this stressful thing coming up, right? I can remember back in law school with exams. It's like, here's exam season. There's a lot of work. It's going to be a very stressful period. Or you're writing a paper. There's a lot of work. It's going to be stressful. At work, you have a deadline. It's going to be stressful. You've got a high volume of work. It's going to be stressful, a difficult case, a difficult client, etc. And so what I'm inviting you to do is simply to start to decouple this idea that stress and productivity must go hand in hand, right? This can be the stress that we feel perhaps with respect to the volume of work, right? When you take on a lot of things to do, and also the complexity, right? I think sometimes we look at the complexity of a task and that creates stress. So what we're doing here is we're simply going to decouple them. And what I'm going to do is share with you 3 steps that you can follow, 3 very simple, doable steps that will help you to reduce your stress and increase output, increase productivity. So how are we going to do that? First of all, before I dive into the strategies, I would invite you to think about stress in your practice. Now, you can also think of stress outside of your practice because we all know that the stressors in life are not limited to the professional work that we do. But for now, let's just focus in on what happens at work. So chances are you've got deadlines. And for you, you might find that deadlines can feel really stressful, especially if you have a tendency to leave things to the last minute, or if you work with people who tend to leave things to the last minute, or if you have people that maybe aren't that great for you to rely on, right? That are in charge of filing or who maybe aren't giving you the information that you need, or maybe you yourself have a really hard time getting started on projects because you want them to be perfect and you're afraid to start them, or you find tasks overwhelming, etc. So timelines for deadlines might be stressful. Timesheets, right? Some of you really dread doing your timesheets, and so they can pile up and cause that uneasy feeling, that stress that you kind of think about your timesheets as you're driving home from work in the evening and thinking, oh, I just didn't do them today. Your boss, right? If you have somebody that you report to who has perhaps a difficult personality, you might feel stress, right? You might see their name in your email inbox and have that feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, ugh, what am I going to do now? What do they have to say to me today? Dealing with other people who are stressed, right? These could be colleagues, your clients. It could be opposing counsel. It could be someone outside of work, right? People who tend to carry a lot of stress within them. You might find when you interact with them, it's almost like their stress feels like it's rubbing off on you, and that creates you to have that feeling of stress. Sometimes it is opposing counsel that is giving you that feeling of stress, right? Maybe they're being really, really difficult to deal with. They're trying to give you a hard time. And so that can feel stressful. Sometimes it's more big picture, right? Like you're going through a career change or you want to go through a career change. And that brings stress about because you're thinking about, well, how do I leave the job I'm in? How do I find a new job? What about interviews? What if I can't find anything? There's a lot of questions that you might have about that. You might feel a lot of stress about your clients, right? You might be working on a mandate for them and you're worried about the outcome and they're worried about the outcome. And so you take on a lot of stress there. You might also feel stress around the things that you say yes to, right? You might be saying yes to too many things and then you're wondering how you're going to actually complete any of them. You might want to say no, but you feel a lot of stress about setting a boundary. I'm sure you've had that experience. I know I have, where I have asserted a boundary. And then afterward, it's almost like a boundary hangover. You're reflecting on it for a few days, potentially thinking, should I have done that? Like, was that the right thing to do? So that can create stress. Sometimes it's stress around marketing or networking. You want to do it, need to do it to grow your practice, but you don't feel good about it. So you avoid it, and that creates more stress. And then finally, another category of stress might be mistakes, right? Things that you actually have done wrong or mistakes that you think you may have made. So there's a whole number of things that might come up in your practice that can be triggers for stress. And this is just a list of items that I came up with for today's podcast episode. There may be many more in your practice. And so the idea here is just to get an idea for you of what the stressors might be, because once we've identified them, then we can deal with them, right? On the flip side of the stress, right, we've talked about less stress. So number one, we want to reduce the stress, but also we want to get more things done. And so that invites the question, right? What isn't getting done because of the stress? And so sometimes it's your work, right? You're so consumed by the overwhelm and stress and negative feelings that you're having about something, whether it's frustration or doubt or fear, whatever that happens to be, that you're avoiding getting work done, right? So less productivity there. If it's your timesheets, right, you maybe feel stressed about them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're working on them. You might be pushing off difficult conversations, whether those are conversations with your boss or opposing counsel or your clients, right? You might be avoiding stressful people, right? If there's people that they carry a lot of stress and you just don't want to deal with them, you might be trying to avoid them altogether. You might be avoiding career decisions and changes that have uncertain outcomes. And so you're putting that off. And most of the time, the situation does not improve on its own. You might be avoiding your clients, right? You might be avoiding giving them updates. You might be avoiding boundary setting with them. You might be avoiding delivering some bad news or sending them the bill for your services. You might also find if you're saying yes to too many things, that there's a lot of things that you want and need to do that aren't getting done because you're so busy doing all these extras that you said yes to. You might also be avoiding opportunities, right? If you're letting that feeling of stress keep you from marketing, networking, or other profile building activities, those are not getting done. And if you do have a mistake that you're dealing with, and maybe you've taken the head in the sand approach, that's not getting dealt with either. And so I realize as I'm listing out this list of things that aren't getting done, these causes of stress, that this may be perhaps making you feel a little bit stressed, which is not my intention, but helpful to see, right? That there are a number of things in your practice that if we can take a closer look at them and develop some strategies to deal with them, that you will be able to better manage your stress around these things and also find a productive way to deal with the problems that are causing the stress in the first place. So now for the tools. The first tool that I'm going to offer to you is one that will reduce your stress. Now, I'm going to say it's going to reduce your stress by half, but I actually don't know to what extent. It depends on how much stress you carry in this particular category. And the way that I'm proposing for you to simply reduce your stress by some level right off the bat, it's like skimming the fat off the milk, right? Skimming the cream off the top, is for you to accept that your practice is going to carry with it a certain level of stress. So accepting the stress will automatically reduce the level of stress that you feel. The reason I say this is that for so many of us, when you have that feeling of stress, then not only are you feeling the stress over the deadline or the timesheets or the difficult conversation, but then you also start to feel stress about having the stress, right? So it's like there's this initial layer of stress, that natural response, and then there's an additional layer of stress. And it's almost like this negative feedback loop. The more stress there is in your life, the more you might feel that you're stressed about your stress. And so what I'm inviting you to do is to accept that there is going to be a certain level of stress in your practice and that that is okay. Now, I find it sometimes helpful to give a percentage, right? Okay, so on a day-to-day, you can expect that 15% of the time, you're going to feel a certain level of stress. This is going to be on average. And having that might just help you accept the fact that sometimes it's just going to be hard. And so that acceptance is what is going to free you up mentally in order to deal with the stressful situation. Now, you may have heard of other coaches talking about this. Byron and Katie, she has this notion of unnecessary suffering, right? This is the idea of, there's that base level of suffering, right? The stress itself. But when we add layer onto that, right? When we resist it, when we fight it, when we complain about it, then we're just adding to the stress. So we just want to clean that portion of the stress out of the equation so that we're not bogging ourselves down with more stress than we need to. Another really helpful resource is Kelly McGonigal, and she has done some amazing work. She's an American psychologist who wrote a book, The Upside of Stress, and there's a TED Talk by the same name. And if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend you do that, because she talks about stress as something that she studied for years in her practice. And what she found after years of research was that stress itself is not harmful. It's stress about stress. It's how we think about stress that is actually more harmful. And so she has some really interesting studies that show that the physiological response, the physiological stress response, is one that actually prepares us to overcome the challenges that come our way. And when we think of stress as being something positive, we actually experience it differently in our bodies than we do if we think that stress is bad. If we think stress is bad, it actually has a different chemical reaction within our bodies. And so when you perceive stress as something that can help you, something that is to be accepted, expected, it's perfectly normal, already we are reducing our levels of stress and potentially impacting the way that that stress is affecting us. So I will refer you to Kelly McGonigal's TED Talk, read the book if you're really interested in it. But that first point for all of us, right, when it comes to less stress, more done, is that we want to simply accept that the stress is going to be there. We're going to expect it. We're going to accept it. And if possible, we're even going to welcome it as a tool to help us overcome the challenge that we are facing. Now, once you do this, or as you do this, you're going to save time that you're otherwise spending being stressed. And you're also going to save some energy. And we're going to now focus and channel both of those onto dealing with the cause of the stress. So that brings us to step 2. So step 1 is to expect it. Number 2 is we want to channel your energy into a specific outcome. Now, the problem that I see with a lot of the lawyers that I work with is that when you feel stressed and when you feel overwhelmed, then what happens is it's almost like, and forgive me for saying this, but it's almost like you're inadvertently creating chaos within your mind, right? Chaos in your brain. And I've been there. And so I know what it feels like. And the best analogy that I can think of is like your kitchen drawer, right? If you've got one of those drawers in the kitchen where you just throw everything in there and you open the drawer and you look inside and it's a mess, right? It's so scary that you open it and you have to close it again because there's so much in there. You don't know what's in there and it's just overwhelming. And so if you're feeling like that about a particular situation, right, you kind of have all these thoughts, you may be overthinking, you might have this like jumble of ideas, but you haven't really thought it through, that can feel really unsettling. And so this next step is what we want to do is we want to do the equivalent of basically giving yourself a goal. And then we want to work our way backward from that goal. So if you imagine the kitchen sink analogy, the kitchen drawer analogy, let's say there's a drawer full of stuff, and what you want to create is a drawer that just has spoons in it. Then your job now is quite simple, right? You can take out the drawer, you can empty the contents, you can look for all the spoons, you can put them back inside, and you can close that drawer, right? You've now taken this jumble of all these different things that may or may not be related to each other, and you've replaced that with a specific goal, and you've accomplished that goal. And I'm inviting you to do the same with the challenges that come your way, right? So if you think about what is happening, the timesheets that aren't getting done, the conversations that you're not having, instead of looking at this jumble of things that feel stressful, these thoughts about what could be happening and what isn't happening, what I invite you to do is to simply pick a specific outcome that you would like to see happen. So that might be you want to bring your timesheets up to date. If the question on your mind is, are you in the right job? Maybe the goal should be, I just want to get a new job. If you have a work product that you need to submit, maybe you need to file an argument with a court, or you have some other deadline that you need to meet and there's a deliverable attached to it, that becomes the goal. If it's giving feedback to somebody, maybe you've got difficult feedback that you need to give to a junior or somebody that you work with and you feel really uncomfortable about it because there's some hard things you need to say. So maybe that becomes a goal, right? You're going to give the feedback that is required to help that person learn and grow and deliver what it is that you need in your practice. It may be bringing somebody new on board. So you want to give yourself a very specific goal, because once you do that, once you take the problem and you frame it as something that needs to happen, that helps you to organize your thoughts, and that chaos, right, is no longer chaos, right? It now becomes this clear list of things that need to happen, which is really step 2. You want to work your way backwards. So create a list. Bullet point is a great way to do this. What are the things that need to happen in order for you to finish your timesheets, right? It might be collecting and reviewing the work that you've done over the past several weeks. It might be that you've got notes that you need to go back to and reflect on and record your time in the system, or write it down for your assistant to enter into the system. You can break down your task into multiple steps, and then you can check off your steps as you go. Now, if it's a discrete task, that's probably enough. You can do your bullet point list and work from there. If it's a bigger project, right? Let's say you're looking at your practice for the next 6 months to a year, and you've got some goals in terms of business development, and you've got all these ideas that are swimming around in your head, and you're thinking, well, who is my ideal client? Which relationships do I want to develop? Who are the people that I want to speak with the most? Then what I'd encourage you to do is, again, to write out your notes, write that bullet point list, all of the different ideas. Then you'll want to organize that list and then create some sort of a timeline, right? You might be breaking it up in terms of 90-day increments. Maybe it's week to week, whatever works for you and whatever aligns with the task. But the idea here is that you want to have created for yourself, right? You've gone from this feeling of stress and overwhelm, and you don't know what to do, to having picked a goal. You've got the steps that you need. You've got a plan to get there. And so you're working your way backwards, and this is going to focus your attention and give you something to work towards. So you get to channel all of that energy. Instead of having that energy kind of just burning up and you're kind of going around in circles, you now have a plan, you've got your energy, and now we're going to execute in a very specific way for you to accomplish that thing, right? And so that brings us to step 3. And step 3 is that you are going to think, act, and speak to yourself in alignment with the best possible outcome. Now, one of the things that can be stressful, especially when you're stressed, is thinking about all the things that can potentially go wrong. So you do want to be aware of some of the potential pitfalls, some of the obstacles that stand in your way. Of course you do. And what I'd also invite you to think about is you want to give yourself a chance to execute in a way that you achieve success. And one of the most effective ways that I know to do this is to put yourself in that position of having already done it, and then think and act and speak to yourself from that place, right? Yes, we know that it's possible that things are going to go completely sideways, but we don't want to be thinking about that, right? It's like when you're on a high platform and people say, don't look down. You don't really need to look down and see how far you could potentially fall. Instead, let's focus on step by step getting to where it is that you want to be going, right? It's like when you're driving and you turn a corner, you're not looking all the different directions that you could turn your car. You're actually looking toward where it is that you want to move your vehicle. So this is exactly the same thing. We just want to keep our eyes focused on the destination, focused on the result, and then we go from there. So what does that mean to think, act, and speak to yourself in alignment with the best possible outcome? Number 1, I think the issue with the thinking is that sometimes when we're in a stressful situation, we're going to start thinking to ourselves in a way that is on default, that only perpetuates the stress. So you might find that on default, you'll conjure up thoughts like, this needs to be perfect. I'm going to mess it up. They're going to hate me. They're going to see that I'm a fraud. And all these thoughts, right? If you catch them, are ones that will make you feel potentially more stressed, that aren't going to help contribute to you getting the job done. So what I invite you to do instead is to channel productive and positive thoughts, right? Things like, I just need to follow the steps that I set out. If I need to, I can try again. I can recalibrate as I go. It will be worth it in the end. So think about what you can tell yourself, what thoughts you can have that will lead you to taking the steps that will result in the outcome that you're trying to create. So we're watching your thoughts. Then we want to look at your actions, right? So think about that. If you're sitting down to rate a brief, and you're telling yourself it needs to be perfect, it's never going to be good enough, the opposing counsel is going to tear this thing to shreds, chances are it's really, really hard for you to actually put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard and produce anything because you're so scared that anything that you produce just isn't going to be good enough. Versus if you were to tell yourself, well, I just need to follow the steps. The first step is to open a document. The second step is to create the headlines. The third step is to sketch an outline. The fourth step is to fill in point number 1. Now you've got this methodical, very tangible series of steps, each of which is not insurmountable, and you can start moving forward, right? You've replaced the thoughts of this is not enough, this is not good enough with I just have to do this one thing. Instead of don't look down at that large drop below you, it's I just need to put one foot in front of the other. So that's why the thinking is important, because it's going to lead to a different set of actions. And so we want to simply take those steps, right? We're going to follow the plan that we have set for ourselves. And each step that we take is going to bring us closer toward resolving that source of stress. And so the third part is the self-talk. And this is an area where I notice a huge improvement with the clients that I work with. And I have noticed a huge improvement in myself. As lawyers, I think not only have we been trained in some cases to subconsciously associate stress with these big things that we're doing, right? Big goals, big projects, high volume of work. I think there's also a link between talking to ourselves in a way that puts a lot of pressure on ourselves and thinking that that is absolutely required to create results. So you might be beating yourself into submission. You might be telling yourself that it's never going to be good enough, that you need to work harder, that so-and-so would do it so much better than you. And this internal voice, right? I've heard all sorts of things that lawyers will say to themselves, brilliant, amazing, capable lawyers will say to themselves. And so what I'm inviting you to do here is to catch what it is that you're saying and to replace any harsh criticism with something that is a lot more supportive. And it might be hard to do this if you're really accustomed to having that internal narrative. And so you might imagine somebody who's really kind to you, maybe a mentor that you've had in the past, or a professor who really took a shine to you and was really supportive of your work. Maybe it's a parent who has been really supportive. Anybody in your life, maybe it's me, right? Maybe it's thinking about what would I say in this situation about you? And what are some of the things that I would say to encourage you to move forward? So you want to start speaking to yourself in that way. And if you've listened to this podcast before, you may have heard me talk about your inner mentor. You may have heard me talk about your inner critic. There are podcast episodes I've recorded previously on each of these topics. And what you're trying to do here is channel the voice of your inner mentor. Now, the critic will still be here, and that's okay. Much like we have stress, and we're never going to reduce stress to zero, chances are the inner critic will remain and have something to say every now and then, and that's fine. But we just don't want to buy into that. We just don't want the inner critic to be the only voice that we're listening to that is chipping away at our sense of self-worth, that is chipping away at our sense of self-value, that is preventing us from taking steps and taking chances that would be great opportunities to grow, to learn, to contribute. And so here, when it comes to this third step, right, we've already talked about reducing the stress by eliminating the stress about the stress. We have talked about formulating a plan, right? We have a clear goal and we've got a plan to get there. And then we've got this internal dialogue, right? We are thinking in a way that supports the outcome that we want. We are taking steps in that direction and we're being nice to ourselves. So if something doesn't go the way that we want it to, if our results don't match our expectations, this is not a reason to beat yourself up or tell yourself that it isn't good enough or you're not good enough. This is a conversation like, well, okay, you have given it your best so far. What else might we try, right? You might tell yourself things like, everything will be fine in the end. This is exactly how it's supposed to play out. You might find that. I know I have found that many times, that things don't always go the way that I want them to. And I tell myself, there's a reason why it's happening this way. And if I look for it, I can often find it. And so I'd invite you to do the same. When things don't really play out the way that you want them to, you might ask what the learning is there, what is great about that situation, what better thing has come about because of things not going the way that you wanted initially, right? There is no hurry, right? If you find that you're someone who gets really anxious over deadlines and you find that you start to rush and panic and make mistakes, it happens, right? You might make careless mistakes. You might be so nervous you can't think straight, and so you make mistakes. You might find that telling yourself there is no hurry, you have all the time you need, might give you that peace of mind that then allows you to take productive action. Another one you might think about is the movie is not over yet. Whenever you watch a movie and you're halfway through and the character is at the bottom of the bottom and they see no way out, there's always that hope, that possibility that things will improve, and they do. And so if you are in the middle of the movie, that's okay. The movie is not over yet. And then you can also, in addition to having almost like statements that you say to yourself, things like, it will be fine in the end, you might find that powerful questions are also effective at bringing out some useful and constructive messages for yourself. So, for example, you might ask yourself, how are you the perfect person for this job, right? If you've been tasked with dealing with a very difficult client, what makes you the perfect person for that client? You might have really amazing people skills. You might be really sensitive to what it is that they are dealing with. You might have very particular expertise in exactly the area of law that they need, and you are the perfect person to help them through their thorny legal problem. So that's a question that can be really helpful. You might ask yourself, what steps do you think you need to take? So you may be doing a task that you've never done before. And if you were to ask yourself, how do I do it? The answer might be, I just don't know. And so if that's the answer, you might ask yourself, okay, if I did know, right? If I had to take a guess, if I had to take my absolute best guess, what steps would be required? And I can guarantee that if you go through that exercise, you are going to come up with some really amazing answers that are going to lead you closer to the outcome that you're seeking. Another question that you can ask yourself, what will you do if your plan doesn't work? I think sometimes we plan in a fantasy world where everything works out exactly as it should. I heard of a study recently about why people are late. And so one of the reasons they gave is that, especially if you're going somewhere by car, you plan your route, you plan the time you leave your house or wherever it is that you're leaving from your office based on there being no traffic. And so what happens is you hop in your car, there's an accident 2 blocks down the road, you have to take a detour, you get all the red lights, etc., and you're late. And so we want to take the same approach when it comes to problem solving on files, on your professional work, your conversations, your interactions, etc. Yes, we would love to be able to micromanage and control the world and have everything work out perfectly exactly the way that we want it to, but that's not always going to happen. And so if you've already brainstormed in your mind what you're going to do as a backup plan, now it's not such a big deal. Oh yeah, I expected that. Now we know how to move forward. And sometimes you'll need to think that up on the spot. I had this happen recently. I was doing a webinar and oh my gosh, it was terrible. My computer decided to shut down. It turns out I've been working from a different part of my house and there's something that's not quite right with the electricity socket. And I was halfway through a webinar and my computer was about to die. And it was not cool. I had to pick up and move over to a different part of the room that I was recording from. And it was not pretty, but I managed to fix the problem, right? And so this is going to happen, right? You're going to be in situations where maybe it's not exactly what you had hoped for or what you had planned for, but you just need to come up with a solution and keep moving forward. So that's what I have to offer in terms of this more done, less stress approach. Number 1 is we want to reduce stress by some percentage, right? By simply not being stressed about the stress. Okay. That is step 1, right? We want to develop a positive relationship with that stress. We can expect it. It's going to be there. We're going to accept it. And then we're going to move forward. We're going to channel our energy into step 2, which is to identify what the goal is. What do we want to have happen here? And then work our way backwards and create a plan for that. And then step 3 is to think, act, and speak to yourself from the place of having already reached your goal. Now, using this formula will be helpful. Number 1, because you'll experience less stress, right? And if you're experiencing less stress, that means less time ruminating, overthinking, procrastinating, complaining, doing whatever it is that you do when you get stressed. I know we all have our go-tos when it comes to stress. And so you might find that you're better able to manage your time around those difficult situations. You will be more focused and therefore more productive, right? If you give yourself something to attach your mind to, you've got your goal, you've got your clear instructions, you now know exactly what it is that you need to do. Instead of reinforcing that negative feedback loop where you feel the stress and then you get stressed about the stress and then the stress just kind of builds on itself, we're now creating a much more positive feedback loop. You feel the stress, you channel your focus, you take action, you reach a solution, you gain confidence because you've now dealt with that stressful situation. And the next time a stressful situation comes around, you're like, yeah, I know how to do this. I'm actually really good at managing stress. I'm really good at being productive and dealing with stress. And what then happens is that you prove to yourself that stress and productivity don't need to be linked in order to get things done. So, my dear, dear friend, I hope you have enjoyed this episode. I hope that you are able to take this mantra with you throughout the year, that you are going to be the kind of person who can experience less stress and get more done. We all know people like that in our professional and personal lives. We are going to be those people this year. And so off you go. Enjoy your month, enjoy your January. And if this is something that resonates with you, right? If you find that stress is part of your practice, that you would love some help when it comes to identifying what the sources of stress are for you and developing strategies, developing a way of getting really good at setting the goal and making the plan and following through on your plan and learning to have a much more positive internal dialogue with yourself, then I highly recommend that you reach out to me because I would love to work with you and help you develop some of those skills so that in your practice, you can have what we're talking about here today, that idea of a much more positive and robust self-support, really, that inner mentor, finding access to it and being able to practice in a way where you are experiencing less stress and more productivity day to day. So that is what I have to share with you this week. I hope your year is off to a beautiful start. I am excited to reconnect with you again in a week's time. Take care. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.